Today I'm going to be talking about suicide and mental health, so if that's something that is difficult for you to read, I will not be going into details, but I do think that it's important to dictate that. And I will also say that I will be reading today, so if I'm not making as much eye contact, that is why I want to read a script, which I cannot do while, reading great eye contact, but this is something that I want to say word by word. So I will include the written thing below, and part of it is from a post I originally made in 2021, and then I added my reflections because of the day in the second half. So thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoy this video as much as you can, and tell me what your thoughts are regarding this conversation. When we speak about Sylvia Plath, we inevitably bring up her death. It comes up innocently enough. There's a brevity that permeates her work. We do occasionally talk about Virginia Woolf's death, but mostly to diagnose. And when it comes to Montgomery or Gilman, we barely mention it, as if old age is an afterthought, so death is irrelevant. But Sylvia Plath, she was 29. She was at the height of her career, the end of her marriage, and her definite work about suicide had just been published. And we're all a sucker for something easily sensationalized. So we talk about suicide, and her hospitalization, and the man who left her, and maybe even the woman who followed. But we don't talk about I am, and how she ended the bell jar not with death, but with tentative hope. And so did I when I finished her early story, Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom. Written about a train, a woman on a train, seeing all this hurt, and finding a way out. And when I looked up the reviews, all I found was death. This was written in 1952, the summer she was 19, and submitted and rejected, rewritten with less rare and rejected, and published only 55 years after her death. And I don't see death. I see her saying she's not ready, not as her leaving Earth, but her forging a new identity outside of trauma. Even in The End of the Bell Jar, months before her death, she speaks about the fear of mental health returning. How all she wants to do is live, and how afraid she is that she won't. So if you read Plath into this work, don't read her in as one who chose death, but one who chose life. One who continued to choose life until one day, or twice in her life, the death was too heavy. The stations weren't stopping. She saw no way out. She arrived at the Ninth Kingdom. I could be reading my own story into hers. But there's a difference between feeling the train chugs on toward collision and wanting that collision. In my mind, there's a version of Sylvia Plath who survived. She survived in 1952, and we can imagine she escaped that train from that bell jar, and now she sits at home at 90 in a knit sweater and helps a third or fourth generation battle depression like she did. 6 years ago today, I tried to take my own life. And though I've struggled with depression every single day of my life that I can remember, that was not my destiny. It was not my fate. It was not inevitable. And it's not something that defines me. That week had been full of emotions. I had just gotten back from Christmas, which had been, very full of family drama. And I was dealing with intense doubt and drama and emotional tension at work, which happened to also be my place of living. So there was no place that was safe, no place that was secure where I could just lay my head and exist without all of the things that were turning in my head going on. I had also just recently been rejected romantically and found out that I had a diagnosis that might lead to fertility and I could never have a family. So dealing with both professional and emotional and familial and all of these tensions and feeling like I didn't have a future, I didn't have anything to grab onto. And it's also true that during this week, we had just seen the inauguration of a president that represented racism and sexism. Then in the last year, 2 of my friends had gone to the United States to study, and in 6 months, both of them ended up with scars that they hold today. One from the great deal of sexism that she received every single day, and one from the sexism and the racism she received that wouldn't accept her as a biracial woman who wanted to tear her apart. And watching their stories and how much scarring that left on their souls, to watch a president who represented and touted that as good come in. I don't want to give too much credit to that man. He was not the only reason. A lot of the others were much more personal and much more direct. But there was a lot of things that added to the camel's back that week. And I think that we do a disservice when we imagine that suicide is something that is fated, as something that is inevitable, that every person who deals with depression and suicidal ideation will end up committing suicide because it's just too heavy, when so often it's how much is being added to one person's plate that they just can't imagine a way out in any way. And that was my day that day. I couldn't imagine a way in which I could enter that day and have peace. The thing is, I could have. My things did not imaginarily disappear the day after I tried to commit suicide, but when I did return, I returned with the scars of that attempt on me and the trauma of living through almost dying. And yet, life continued. I still struggled with my mental health and the stressors and everything that happened then, every day after that day that year, and I still do this year. But the impact of that, because of therapy and because of friends and because of God and because of all these things that have happened in my life, that because I survived that day have happened, are amazing. And it doesn't eliminate what happened that day and the scars that I wear in my soul from that. But to define me by that is not useful or productive, and it paints a narrative that is ugly and that is not good for people who struggle with suicide. And there's the concept in comics that's called One Bad Day. It is epitomized in The Killing Joke. This is a 1987 or 1989 comic in which Joker is convinced that if he just gets Batman to snap because of a terrible day, he'll become just like him. And the Joker wants chaos. He wants that. He wants to show Batman that he is just as corruptible as him. And it takes one bad day. And I don't think that that is true. I don't like the comic very much. And the comic, depending on the interpretation, either subverts that or submits to it. And I think that a lot of that is, the nihilism of the 1980s and the ways in which they perceived these things. And that still bleeds into how we perceive things today, where we believe that things are just terrible, so we don't need to go on. And I will never believe that that is true. I believe the opposite is true. That one bad day is what does not define us. We will all have bad days. Sylvia Plath had already survived a suicide attempt at this point, and I have as well. And those days could have gone differently. My life could have ended, her life could have ended, and different areas would have come out. But because of that, it's not useful to define ourselves based on that, to define a person based on that. And I think that it does a disservice to every day we choose to live to say that our destiny or our ways in which we filter someone's life is seen through that suicide. And I'm not saying we should pass over the looming depression and experiences of mental health. That is never going to be useful. I will struggle with mental health, and I will probably have it as an impactful force in my life through the rest of my life. But it's actually not as bad as it was then. Like, what my experience of mental health today and in healing and stuff like that is today is what I could never have imagined 6 years ago. There's not a version of me that imagined that this amount of peace was possible. And not to say that I don't deal with mental health, because I do, but the gravity of it has lessened. And part of that is to do with hope, to do with the idea I stopped believing that this was my fate. And I know that that can very easily go into positive thinking and stuff like that. I'm not saying you can cure depression through positive thinking, but I do think that the way that we frame people, I believe that when we frame people as hopeless, we stop fighting for their hope. And as someone with depression, it's very hard to imagine a future. It's very hard to get out of the tunnel and to imagine that there could be hope one day. And I think as people who come alongside people who have depression, it's so important to believe in that hope and say, this is a tunnel, there will be a bright light. And not to say that that bright light will exist forever. I do believe that, most people have seasons of depression through their life. Like, there will be hard times, but that doesn't eliminate the good. And that also doesn't eliminate that there are good times within depression. Life does not exist only of pain at 24/7 all the time. And I think that that's sometimes the story we sell. And it's not a story that I think helps anyone who's in that pain to say that this is your reality and this is your future and this is your destiny. I think when we characterize Sylvia Plath's life as a descent into death, we say that suicide is inevitable, that her life was going to end this way because she suffered with depression. And I think that that's not true. And I think that does a disservice to people who struggled with suicide and struggle with suicide ideation. And I think it eliminates the social responsibility to do better, or to fight for a world that has better mental health help, that, allows us to sacrifice our time and money for people who are struggling with mental health. Because if we view people as this is their lot, then why would we help them? That's nihilism. But I think that by choosing to say this is something that I'm not going to say is inevitable, it's something that we can change. Hopelessness is a really powerful tool. And it's never helpful for the people who we view as hopeless. I also think it's very dangerous to romanticize someone's suffering rather than to fight for a world where they are well. And that's why I celebrate every January 23rd as something that I survived, as something that I continue to live, and that I chose life, and I can continue to choose life. Even when it is hard, I can look back and say, not that this is my destiny, but this is something that I survived, so I can survive again. And I think we do really need to change the way in which we look at Sylvia Plath, in which we look at the women and the men who have committed suicide, because when we view that as something that cannot be changed, we won't fight to change it.